Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to All Aces on Air. I am so excited for today's episode because we have the wonderful Shay Stewart-Bouley here. And for folks who don't know, um, we have been threatening for many years to start some trouble together. And today, I think, is the beginning of the possibilities of some trouble that can be started. And I know it's been overused, but I will bring him into the space, just like John Lewis said, that little bit of good trouble, right? So I'm trying to do a lot of good trouble. So, and it's a pleasure to have Shay on the show. You know, we first met when I was the chief resilience officer for the city of Boston, and we were trying to explore ways to partner, and we like had all these ideas, and then life happened, and then we stayed connected, and she was kind enough to invite me to speak at CCI's Community Change Inc.'s last celebration. And so I'm just really excited to be here today with her and welcome her to All Aces on Air. And want to begin by just giving some space to have her introduce herself. And, you know, Rico loves to say this, your elevator pitch for yourself around how did you become you? What's the shortest way you can say that?
First off, let me say thank you. Thank you for having me on the show. And you are so right. We connected, it seems like many years ago, 12 lifetimes ago, threatened to connect, make some good trouble. And then like life happens. And yet here we are. So thank you for having me. Describing myself, I am a Chicago native, born and raised, spent almost the first 30 years of my life in Chicago. Grew up, as I like to put it, on the intersection of poor and working class. Found myself, in New England almost 20 years ago. Currently, I serve as the executive director for Community Change Inc., which is a 52-year-old Boston-based anti-racism organization. I'm the first Black woman to head CCI. Most certainly an honor to, sit in this position. I am also the creator of a website called Black Girl in Maine, which now includes a podcast, speaking engagements, other things that we do. I started off writing the blog myself. We now have one staff writer as well as some contributing writers. It's a weird place to find myself. If someone had told me 25 years ago, I'd be living on an island off the coast of Maine, running a nonprofit based in Boston, doing something called anti-racism work, I would have said, no, I don't think so. So, that's who I am. I'm still that working class kid. I always refer to myself. I'm still a scrappy working class kid from the South Side of Chicago. Do with that what you will. As I like to joke, don't let this New England facade confuse you. I'm still Chicago all the way. So that is me.
Well, welcome all of you to the show, including the West Side of Chicago. And really, I think, for me to take a step back for folks who are joining the show who have never watched the show before. My name is Dr. Atyia Martin, and I am the CEO and founder of All Aces Inc. And for today, this theme of uprising, right? This theme of how we came to be and what inspired us to do this work. So would love to hear more about kind of, I think there's this misconception that because we're people of color, we're Black women, that this stuff just comes easy to us. And, you just wake up one day and you have a PhD in oppression, right? Talk a little bit about kind of the things you remember about the beginning of your journey and when you kind of had that conscious moment of feeling like you were transitioning into kind of this racial equity, social justice. Like, was it obvious to you? Was it, more subtle than that? Like, how was that for you?
So I'm going to take us back to the beginning of the journey because when I think of my life, I really have to think of literally the beginning of the journey. I am the product of a man who was born and raised in Blytheville, Arkansas. My father, Reverend Stewart, who recently passed away. And my dad grew up under Jim Crow. My dad was one of 16 kids. And so my dad, as a child, up till he was about 12 or 13, actually picked cotton because my grandparents were sharecroppers. As a result, my family on his side, a large number of my aunts and uncles, mostly my uncles, were part of the Great Migration. Like, they grew up and they were like, we're out of here. We're going to Chicago. At one point, my grandparents, Alan and Vera Stewart, did go to Chicago, but decided they didn't want to raise their kids in Chicago. So back to Arkansas they went. The reason that's really significant is because, my dad married my mom, who came from a pretty middle class at the time. When you think about the 50s and 60s, very middle class Black family. They had a little bit of affluence, a little bit of wealth, but it's kind of interesting because there was a lot of colorism in her family. My mom was really dark skinned. She was like the only dark skinned person in a family of light skinned Black people. So my parents getting together was this sort of like weird space. I was born in the early 70s. I always joked, and it's true, my parents are like Black hippies. But my dad had a really interesting perspective in that, he raised us, my brother and I, when we were little kids. We would live in predominantly white neighborhoods, which I didn't understand at the time what they were doing. But now we have the research to understand. They wanted us to have the best education they could afford. So they would find the most affordable place they could in a predominantly white neighborhood in Chicago at certain points for us to kind of get ahead. Which, for me now looking back, it's like, they should have been advocating for more resources, but I get it. They didn't have that language. But the interesting thing is that as a result of going, in many cases, being like the only Black kid in school for many grades, I was surrounded by white folks. And I'll never forget, I came home, I had a little crush. It was like middle school. I had a crush on a white boy. And my dad sits me down. Now, at this point, he had never really talked to me about race or how he grew up or anything. But he says to me, he calls me by my childhood nickname, which is Rabbit. Rabbit. God made apple trees, God made orange trees, baby, but he didn't mean for apple and orange trees to go together. So, I was like, what? So being that if you tell me one thing, I've always been that hard-headed kid, we're going to fast forward the story. I ran off at 18. I married a white boy because that's what I was going to do. Like you tell me not to do something, I'm about to do that. So my first husband is a white guy who had Maine roots, grew up in New England, came from a level of privilege. He had some descendants who were part of the Mayflower and all of that stuff. So by the time I discovered, oh, that was a really bad thing to do, I'm pregnant. Like I'm pregnant with my son, who I give birth to at 19. So I had no language. This was like, at this point, we're talking like, 92, 93. So I have no language around the things that I'm dealing with around race, cross-racially. Long story short, all I know is that by the time our son was 2.5, it was clear this marriage was not going to work. Interestingly enough, over the years, I now understand the undercurrents of what was happening. Race. Race was always there for us. So, I got to be hard-headed. I do it again. I get remarried again at 24. I marry another white guy. But what's interesting is at this point, I go back to school to get my undergraduate degree, and I end up doing a self-designed BA at DePaul University in African American Studies, specializing in health and wellness, like racial health disparities. I was very fascinated by this concept because I looked at like my family tree. Why are we all like sick and dying earlier than my white friends' families? So even though I still didn't have the language for it, like that we're using now, there was clearly sort of this awakening. I graduated, I can't remember what year, something in 1990, something, I decided I wanted to actually study African-American history because it dawned on me there was a lot I didn't know. Had a little bit more understanding of how race operated. The first year of my second marriage, we had gone to a wedding, my second husband, Jeff, and we got pulled over. It was one of these, roadblock things. And we were at that time probably about 25 and 30. And the officer pulls my husband over and says, license, registration, but then says, who's the woman in the car next to you? And he goes, what? Who is the woman in the car? Meaning me. And he goes, that's my wife. And he goes, do you have proof that that's your wife? And so I immediately was like, oh, we realized he thought I was a sex worker. Like I couldn't. That incident became a turning point for both of us. Like, he had never had this situation. I'd been around long enough to kind of pick up on when things happen. But, it really hit when we moved to Maine. We moved here in 2002, primarily because of the custody arrangement with my first husband and my son. And at that point, growing up in Chicago, I knew about racism. I can still tell you the first time I got called an N-word. I was 16 and it was a 5-year-old white child who called me. He said, look, mama, there's an N-word. There's an N-word. Never forgot that. But moving to Maine just changed everything for me. So, at that point, I was here about a year when I really needed to just start writing about what I was seeing. So I approached some papers and said, hey, some local newspapers, can I write about diversity or the lack of diversity here? One of them, the Portland Phoenix, which was part of the Boston Phoenix family at that time, actually in 2003 gave me a column, which I wrote for over 13 years called Diverse City. And the first 6 months that I wrote, we got death threats mailed to the editor because I was naming things. And again, I was still, growing in my development. At that point, I was in graduate school in New Hampshire, really starting to put together an analysis around race. And really it took, my son becoming a teenager here that was when my uprising really, I would say, started. When he was 16, he went for a walk and he got brought back by a police officer. He had gone to the store to get an iced tea and a sandwich. Very, very reminiscent. This happened years before what happened to Trayvon Martin. And when the Trayvon Martin story came, happened, I was like, but by the grace of God. My son got brought home in a police car because they thought he looked like a suspect who had been breaking into cars in the small town we lived in. Now, I luckily hadn't answered the door. I wasn't home. I was at a meeting. My then second husband, who's white, answered the door. And so when he answered the door and, he's like, this your son, it's a stepson. He goes, yeah, that's my boy. What's the problem? Well, we thought he looked like, a suspect. And my ex-husband said, no, man, you just did that because you saw that black boy. And the guy's like, no. The officer gives him no, I'm not a racist, blah, blah, blah. And he goes, bull crap. That's exactly what just happened because my son said, the cop was really nasty and mean to him. But when he pulled into the driveway and was like, this is your mother's house. And he's like, yes, that's my mother and stepfather's house. And then when Jeff opened the door and he sees this like prim and proper white man, it became, that point and watching what my son experienced as a teenager, really as a mother, that was really what, like, I would say that's when because the kids would say it was on like Donkey Kong. And most certainly as the years started going on, I lost my mom in the early 2000s. Saw the health disparity issue there in terms of her health care and what happened. It was really just a convergence of a lot of things in my personal life that forced me to take the blinders off. I had always known that racism was there, but it really wasn't until I saw it play out in my family. My mother died 4 days after turning 50. There was no reason for that. And it's interesting. I'm creeping up toward her age that she was when she died. And I joke with people and people don't understand. I'm like, I worry about dying early and people who are white don't get that. I'm like, look, in my immediate family in recent decades and generations, people don't live as long as they once did. There's something going on here. We die early. Even my dad, he died, right before turning 70. So I think about it. So my personal experiences as a Black woman navigating in white spaces took me from, this desire, I would just want to be like a historian of Black history and mind my business to wait, how do we get it popping? How do we make change? And that literally 2012 election, I was writing my blog undercover in Maine. At that time, I was ED of a youth development facility in a little town called Biddeford, Maine. The people on the board didn't know I was a writer because I figured they weren't going to know anything. That year, there was the presidential election, and the then governor of this state, real evil cat by the name of Paul LePage, made a statement that, there were reports of Black people being bused here to vote. So there used to be a show, you might remember it at that time, that was on MSNBC, the Melissa Harris Perry Show. Well, they wanted to find out if there were any Black people in Maine to counter what this then governor said. So when you have a blog called Black Girl in Maine and you're trying to find Black people in Maine, guess who they find? They found me. I ended up being a guest on the show on a Saturday. I'm thinking nobody's going to see that show. I mean, I'm going to go back to work and I'm just going to act like I wasn't on national TV over the weekend talking about race in Maine. You know what happened? Everybody knew I was on TV. It's like, you were on the TV. Like, my cover was busted. So at that point, it became like, well, at this point, y'all know what I'm doing, because you know how it is when you work in white establishments as a Black person, especially in a white state. Like, I had to play that game. And that really became, after being on her show, like, I guess I can't play that game anymore. So I decided I wanted to do something. And just on a whim, on summer of 2013, CCI was looking for another executive director. I had no connections to anybody in Boston, but I thought, well, they're looking for somebody with serious like management and understanding of race. And so my master's is in administration and supervision. So I was like, I have those skills and I obviously know about race. Figure they're not going to call me up. I'm not going to get a job. Okay. So they ended up calling me like 3 months after I sent my resume in. And so I had the first interview with the board chairs, and that was a phone interview. Then they invited me to come to the second interview. At this point, I'm like, oh, I get to leave Maine for the day. Okay, well, we'll chalk it up as a win. Then they invite me back for the third and final interview. And at this point, I'm like, are they going to really hire me? You know, because at interview 2, I met the whole staff. I was like, oh, okay. You know, interview 3 happened, and Atyia, I didn't even make it all the way back home to Maine, and the board chair called me and said it was a unanimous vote that they want to hire you. Like, get out of here. So I started in January of 2014 and was really able at that point to no longer hide who I am. I could be free and clear in my, you know, what I say and how I operate. And since then, it has just been nonstop in terms of what can we do to like make this thing not just my personal uprising, but even thinking about the work that we've been creating now at CCI, some of it which, you know, will be unveiled at our upcoming event, our gala. It's like we're all in this place. And most certainly, I would say right now, there's even more of an uprising sense in me as I look at where we are as a culture in this country right at this moment. Where, you know, I've been saying since the spring, this is the uprising, man. This isn't in a book anymore. Like it's happening. It's happening, and it's happening right now. So that's uprising story and how it relates. And man, that was a babble. I'm sorry about that.
No,
there were so many pieces there that I just couldn't get to one piece without telling the whole story.
Of course. And I mean, and these are our life stories, you know, where however many decades we have been living and there's a lot, I think that's helpful for people to understand about how we evolve into these spaces. So I know for me, there was a lot that you said that resonated. So number one, I know, so for me, you know, my journey started really, really young. And I had, and, you know, I've told this story very briefly before that in kindergarten, my first school experience, I was one of the only Black kids in the class. I think I was the only Black girl in the class. And I used to get picked on by the students a lot. And the teacher treated me differently. And I didn't really understand at the time, right? And it got so bad that, you know, I remember one day, and I remember so vividly, you know, another student had picked on me and I defended myself and I got in trouble and I had to go stand in the corner in the back of the classroom. And that's when I had told my mother, I was like, you know, I don't want to go back there anymore. And I told her why, even though I didn't have the context on why I was on the receiving end. And, you know, to her credit, she took me out of the school and we figured something else out. But I remember being fascinated by the dynamics. And I was like, I don't understand what happened. I need to know. Like, I really want to understand because, you know, there were moments where my classmates were just like regular kids and okay. And then they would have these other moments where, you know, I was, they were remembering that I was different from them. And it was an opportunity for, you know, other folks to create bonds at my expense. And I remember kind of growing up and, you know, we moved every few years. So I grew up in Boston, born and raised. And I remember, you know, I probably lived in 10 different places within the city of Boston before I graduated from high school. And I ended up moving out when I was 16. And that whole like experience of, you know, I was always, for the most part, a good kid. Like I was valedictorian in middle school. Like I've always been a nerd. It's who I am. I own it and embrace it about myself. But then I started having more nuanced and sophisticated experiences with racism as I got into the workplace. So I started working really young. I was 13 when I had my first job. My first job wasn't legal, but and I remember engaging with these folks in the workplace who thought I was older. So for most folks didn't know, they thought I was older, and just kind of making note of them, like, oh, that was weird that they, thought that, and then I would explain a situation, and it would be the opposite of what they assumed about me. And I started reading more, and by the time I finished high school, went to college, I think is where I really started getting more language. So my first year of college was at Florida A&M University, which is a historically Black college and university. Now, coming from Boston and going there,
I'm sorry, I had to laugh.
was like a culture shock, right? So, we live in a segregated city in Boston. And so, I, for the most part, always grew up around Black people. And our Latinx brothers and sisters, for the most part, like that was like my world. But to go to a historically Black college and university, I actually got exposed to a broader range of Black people, like uber rich Black people. I was like, there's uber rich, like this many uber rich Black people, Black people from all over the world, and just really learning to appreciate the diversity of who we are. And as well as being able to see a lot of the internalized racism, right? The classism, the colorism, and how that gets intertwined with the internalized oppression, and it was really, really fascinating for me. And then when I I came home, came back to Boston and went to Bentley. Back then it was Bentley College. They weren't all fancy and they weren't a university yet. But I remember working in a different job and loved my job. I went to school full time and worked full time. And predominantly white organization. I was really young. Everyone thought I was older than I was, but was really young in the role. And I loved my job, and I poured a lot of energy into school and my job. And I remember they were doing layoffs, and I got called into the leadership's office, and I didn't know that they were in the process of doing layoffs. So the way they played it is they said, your performance hasn't been up to par. And I was like, well, what do you mean? All of my assessments and evaluations have said that I actually performed above and beyond. And they said, well, but it's the subtle things, and I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. Either I'm doing good at the work or I'm not. Either I'm showing up and being respectful to everybody in the workplace and working collaboratively with folks, or I'm not. There's no, like, what are you referring to? And they were talking about, professionalism and, all of the coded language.
All that coded stuff that by now we both know what that means.
Exactly. So, I was trying to process the experience in the moment, and literally they were like, well, basically, none of that matters because we're letting you go. And, like that was basically the summary of the conversation. And, we're letting you go. And they let go of myself and several other, a small group of us. But it was really my first experience with like this weird workplace, kind of like, I didn't have a lot of microaggressions there, but there were some, and it was the same people who were in that space making the decision about whether or not I belonged there anymore, regardless of anything that I sacrificed to make sure the work got done and all of the other realities. I fast forward a little bit, and I ended up in Atlanta working for a magazine, a small mom and pop shop magazine company. They had two magazines. One is super known and one is people laugh at every time I say it. So the one that people laugh at every time I say it is Progressive Farmer was one of their magazines.
I'm sorry, I totally get why everybody Progressive Farmer. Yeah, I can't say that I ever read that one.
And then the other one was Southern Living Magazine.
I have heard of that one.
Yes. So all of that said, while I was there in Atlanta, I ended up getting recruited into the Air Force. I was older when I got recruited into the Air Force, and when I got into boot camp, and I was reading the manual. So I'm already in the military now, right? Like I'm in it. There's 70 females. We're all in this like open dorm space and bunk beds and all kinds of military structure. Getting up at 5 o'clock and 4:30 in the morning and all this other craziness. And I'm reading the guidelines, and it said, and we were studying for a test, and it was talking about what you could not do in the military, and how you needed to wear your hair. And two of the things on there, one was you could not have cornrows, and the other one was you could not have locks, or what they call dreadlocks. And I had locks.
And I would imagine that most sisters in the military at that time, because y'all weren't going to have time to go to the shop every couple of weeks. So it's going to be some time. So you're either putting some braids in or you got some locks in. Either that or you rocking a Caesar, because there's no other option to keep your hair. Yeah. Wow.
Right. And you got to wear a hat so you have to have your hair in a style where you can put a hat on. And I remember being like, wait a minute. So this is basically saying, Black woman, you're not welcomed here. Like that's what you're saying, because who else would you be targeting with this?
Right.
And I remember you're relaxing your hair on the battlefield. Yes, blessings. So at the end of the day, it was the funniest part of it though was as I'm navigating through the military, nobody even knew that I had locks. Like I wore them to the code, and I wore them in a bun to the standards, an inch and a half wide, no more than 2 inches, and like all the stuff. And so I never got in trouble, except I did notice some of the Black sergeants and things like that would like do a double take, but then they'd like keep it cool. They'd like keep it moving. But like I knew, I was always under threat of getting in trouble because of my hair. And it's so bizarre that I navigated 4 years of being active duty Air Force with my hair on my mind the whole time.
That's insane, because you think about it, and none of your white peers had that trouble, that issue.
Exactly.
Like of all the things you should have been worrying about in the military, hair should not have been at on that list at all. And yet, as Black women navigating a white world, like hair becomes the thing that you think about. It's like, my hair.
Exactly. And there are horror stories of folks that I have met who, have relaxed their hair when they didn't want to, because of work or pressure from another Black person. This is internalized oppression. Another Black person, R.L. Slaughter, they have since changed those policies. And you won't be surprised that it was very recently. It was just in the last few years that they changed that policy. So for me, like, and throughout my journey, I'm like searching for language. I'm constantly reading. I'm constantly like, I know that I can see that these things are happening. I'm advocating in the moment, but I'm still struggling to like really do it well. And it wasn't until I came home. I worked for the FBI for a while. I won't even go into the details of that hot messness of being there. And when I got to, I did a consulting gig with this company that was working with the Boston Police Department, and to set up their regional intelligence center. And so I came in. So by this time, I'm a Black woman, specifically African American. I speak Serbian Croatian, right? Because that was my job in the military. I was a Serbian Croatian linguist and analyst, and I was assigned to the National Security Agency. So here I am.
So just as an aside, before this show, we were talking about my new favorite show, The Blacklist.
Yeah.
And I'm just hearing you say that. I'm like, that sounds like a really blacklisty sort of thing there. I just had to say that because we were talking about The Blacklist before the green room. So, wow.
Yes. And so, it's here I am, and I kid you not, I can't make this stuff up. So two random, like, horrible situations. So one is the Minister of Internal Affairs from Serbia comes to the police department to visit this new regional intelligence center because it's the talk of the law enforcement world, like, internationally. And here I am, looking like this, walk up to him. So him and the person who was with him, who was his translator, they're talking the whole time. And, I wasn't really paying attention to what they were saying. So I wasn't, ear hustling or anything. But I went over and introduced myself in Serbian, Croatian, and started talking to them. And you should have seen how the color ran away from their face. I mean, they got so pale when I started talking Serbian and Croatian to them, and for them Serbian. They were like, and they were just quiet. They didn't,
because in their minds it did not compute that someone who looked like you would actually even know that language. Like, it was just like, okay, there's a Black person there, but this is the file clerk or something. But it wouldn't even compute. And just like thinking about like how that had to feel to you, because at that point you just like, okay, I know what this is.
Yes. And I'm just standing there, and they're like quiet, and they're just staring at me, and I'm looking at them. And another one of my colleagues comes over, who, random coincidence, was a white guy who also spoke Serbian, Croatian, who was in the army, and he was in the same job I was in, just different part of the intelligence community. So he comes over and he introduces himself, and they like wake back up again, and they start to engage with him. And so I interrupted and I said, "You still haven't introduced yourself to me in Serbian to them." And they were like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I just never, how do you say, I just never, it's like, oh, you never met a Black person who spoke fluent Serbian? Okay, that's, all right. So we're being honest here." But I had several situations like that where it would like freaked people out, and they literally had these moments of like, that's not possible. And as I went through my career, I also began to get into situations where the work I was doing impacted real communities, like on the ground, during, and after emergencies. And I think what was really fascinating is to see a lot of pain and hurt in the community, to see how resources were not being distributed in a way that met the needs. Um, that was painful. And this is after Katrina, right? So this is all fresh in my mind. And now I'm in the field of emergency management, and I'm working with folks who allegedly we all felt some kind of way about Katrina, but it's like, here we are in the field, several years later, and we're still doing the same stupid things. And so I ended up building up my ability to have these conversations even more, because my kids were getting older, and my husband and I are now trying to figure out how we are intentional about how we talk to them about these issues in a way that doesn't lead them to victimhood, right? But like where they can see their power, where they can step into it. And then as we're talking about this, I'm realizing I'm not so sure that I know how to do it well. And so I realized, like, I found myself speaking up more in the workplace when things were happening. I didn't always feel good about the language, but I felt good about kind of overcoming that feeling that that's been internalized and kind of we've been conditioned into, where if you speak up, you're a troublemaker.
Right.
If you advocate, you're a troublemaker, as opposed to in order for us to do the best work, in order for us to make the best decisions, we need to have all of these different perspectives and pitfalls laid out in front of us so that we can do the damn thing, right? And so to be kind of labeled a kind of troublemaker is what I kind of became. And I started to own it. And I was like, I'm not a troublemaker, right? I care about my job and I want to do well and I want to support the community well. So if that is the definition of a troublemaker, then I'm a troublemaker. And the more I practice advocating, the more I begin to like build that muscle. And Kieran Mangalam is asking, how does one have a personal uprising and still have functional relationships with dominant culture? My trust has been eroded over my 20 years of living on and off in Maine. That is a heavy question, and I'm going to come to that. I'm going to wrap up by saying, it took me a while to find my own voice in how I advocated, not just for myself, but for my community when I'm noticing things, getting comfortable with saying Black, right? Like even things that we take for granted that that in predominantly white spaces, which emergency management is one of the most predominantly white spaces in terms of a field that you can work in, second only to like, I don't know, architecture or engineering. I would say, those are the kind of spaces where those words make everybody uncomfortable, where everyone's like, oh, you said Black. And, it's like we say it now, but I think we take for granted how in a lot of spaces, just saying that word puts a target on you. Like, oh, why are they bringing up Black issues? They're always talking about that Black stuff as if Black is being Black or being a Black person. And bringing up issues that are disproportionately burdening Black people is somehow not connected to the conversation. It's somehow not connected to what we need to be focusing on. So I'm going to end this piece with, for me, I think the journey that I continue to be on is how to maintain my integrity and my dignity as I'm navigating the world when I'm constantly being pulled. And it's a lot easier. It's more comfortable to like go along with a lot of this stuff. I was going to say something else with a lot of this stuff. Right? And so it's a constant effort to be present, to not let things slide that matter to me, to lean into my values and my dignity, so that when I go home at the end of every day or in this virtual space, when I get off the computer, right, that I still feel like when I think back on my day, that when I think about what my values are and how I behaved, that those things were aligned. And so I'll stop there, and I want to get to Kieran's question about, how does one have a personal uprising and still have functional relationships with dominant culture? And this is a good one. So I've been doing a lot of talking. So I want to pass it over to you to kick us off on this question.
I think that the personal uprising piece is really critical. I think that it has to happen. Both Dr. Martin and myself have shared our own personal journeys to our own personal uprising, and what has brought us to this moment and to our work. And most certainly the work that I do as both Black Girl in Maine and the work that we do at Community Change, especially the work we're now doing at Community Change, is really bringing in that piece that this is internal work that has to happen. That if you can figure out that it's not merely going through a to-do list of how to do things to be better, but that you understand that this is something that I'm feeling in my total being, and it has to start with me. And then from there, it spreads out to my circle, whether it's, hearing Dr. Martin talk about, wanting to have language to talk to her own kids about this. That's the way to me, it has to flow. And then it starts going out into the larger world. I think that it's entirely possible to have a personal uprising and still have a functional relationship with the dominant culture, because once you start having the personal uprising, you become able to see the dominant culture for what it is. Most certainly as a Black woman, I've had to fight and I still fight the internalized racism that comes in, which in my own mind situates white people and aspects of white culture as better. Instead, for me, anybody who has read any of my recent work or has heard me speak, especially if you've ever heard one of my recent speaking engagements, I'd probably say in the last year, I'm really explaining to white people that the reason that white people get into anti-racism work right now should be not to help Black people, to help Indigenous people, to help people of color, but to actually help yourselves, to understand that it's like the Matrix. You're not really quite seeing what you think is real. And that if you understand that the dominant culture is deeply hurting, it is deeply disconnected from its own reality. I'm going to go political for a moment. We have white people in this country who are disregarding public health policies because a man who is essentially carries pretty racist ways is telling them to. Like, that's not healthy. So that culture, to me, that dominant culture, I look at it and I go, I kind of don't want to be a part of that. I personally would like to start it all over again because it's not healthy. I know it's not healthy for BIPOC folks. And honestly, it's not healthy for the white folks either. So that's how I'm able to balance those two parts of being in my own space, having my own uprising, but understanding that this is a sick culture. That culture is sick and in need of help.
I'm so glad you brought that up because a few things. So the unhealthiness of the dominant culture, right? And so it is literally killing people. You are absolutely correct, Blessing. I'm saying this in public for the second time. I'm working on a book.
Yay!
And yay. So I'm very excited. It's called We Are the Question and the Answer. And so one of the things that I've found as I've been looking into filling the gaps in what has been harder for me on my journey in really trying to solidify my understanding of racism, what it is, how it works, and what we're supposed to do about it. As I've been on my journey, there's been a lot of things that just have felt missing to me or reframed or framed in a way that made Black people and people of color really feel like props in the situation, or where you don't have any power, because you're a person of color, so you can't be racist. And I know what people are saying, right? But the way that is expressed is just sit over there and let white people do their thing, right? You just sit and wait.
Woo! Let me just pause you for a second. I might have to come back to your show, or I'm gonna have to get you on my podcast so we can talk about that.
Yeah.
I gotta be honest, in this current moment, I'm like, we're not victims, man. Don't let these people play us like, oh my God, white people save us. No. Our ancestors did not go through all of this for us to be begging white people for humanity and for them to do anything. As you can see, I'm really passionate about that.
Listen,
so as you continue.
As you should be, because it's funny that you said so finish this point and then I want to come back to that. So when I look at what they call white supremacy culture, right, the characteristics of it, and thank you for those pioneers before us who really tried to filter the world down into those characteristics. I actually looked at those and I said, and it was just ironic, it just happened. And I was looking at cognitive distortions separately for something completely different. And cognitive distortions are basically what psychologists refer to as, it's under the umbrella of cognitive bias. And it's what happens, it's when we use filters to narrow the world in an unhealthy way, right? In a super unhealthy way. And we distort reality. And we can distort reality to the point of almost like it's now fantasy. It no longer aligns with the real thing, right? And so there's this whole piece around healthy ego functioning where it's like, okay, these are the components, these are the things that we need in order to be healthy human beings. And so when you use the word healthy, the dots were connected, because all of the things that all of the research says that we need to do to be healthy, have healthy ego functioning, to be resilient, are the opposite of white supremacy culture.
Yes.
It's literally the opposite, right? And I just had this moment, and I was like, oh my goodness. So all of this dysfunction, which we know is dysfunction, but it literally aligns directly with these what they call weak ego characteristics. The sense of grandiosity, right? This this insecurity, but it comes off as fake I'm
Yes.
trying to be confident, right? And it's a lot of the traits that we're taught to be, not just from a white perspective, because really no one's taught to be white explicitly, right? It's you're taught to be normal, and normal by default in this
Is
country
white.
white. But when you go to leadership training, right, they teach you these ways of being that are the opposite of healthy, right? And so it's so baked into everything that I know that in my relationships with white people, to get to this dominant culture and like build that relationship, I begin to better understand what James Baldwin was talking about when he said he felt sorry for white people.
Yes.
I don't think I always understood it until I like connected those dots. Like I understood it, but I probably couldn't expound on it any more than what he said explicitly. And really, part of it is not all white people, right? But folks who are so in their human development, they're at this place where you just go along to get along. And if you're just going along to get along, all of this stuff is inside of you. And in fact, you have not chosen for yourself who you want to be. Someone else has handed you the prototype and said, fit into this box. You people of color, you fit into this stereotype box. And everybody is supposed to be these things. And that's how the world is supposed to be, nice and neat and tidy. When the reality is, as for all of us, racism does this perverted thing of kind of separating us from ourselves if we let it.
Absolutely. Right? I mean, I think that that's a key piece of it. I practiced yoga and have for 12 years. And, once you get past the practice of asana, which are the poses, but into the more spiritual aspect of yoga, you understand, and really any deep religion or spirituality, you understand that you exist in two dimensions. And I think that in dealing with racism, like people have to understand there's that external self, there's that internal self. And until you make peace with the internal, you're not even going to begin to like deal with that external piece. And you can't be healthy until you do that.
Mm-hmm. And that applies to all of us. And so for my fellow Black people, my fellow BIPOC people out there, you got work to do too. The stuff is so pervasive. I still am unlearning things and checking myself consciously, like managing myself as not to fall into old patterns or patterns that are common around me, right? Because you walk into a space and someone says or does something, or you virtually enter a space and someone says or does something, and it'd be easier just to let it go, right? But to be present and making sure that when I am in spaces, especially in moments that matter, especially if my name is associated with something, that I speak up about things. And when it comes to being in relationship with white dominant culture, the other thing I had to learn, because I used to be really angry at white people. Like I didn't understand how they didn't get it. Like, and this is when I was a kid. I'm like, I'm a kid and I get it, right? And I didn't have all of the language, but like I can see this obvious stuff. And I realized that there's actually there's a quote that I came across that's if it's not your struggle, it's invisible to you.
Yep.
And then I always add to it, unless someone shows you or unless you learn. And that's how a lot of white people are. And that's how some Black folks are too, and other people of color. Whereas like there are times where our own struggle is invisible to us.
Absolutely. And I think just hearing you say that, I'm struck by, I know there's a lot of anger with some of our young brothers and sisters right now. The world is unfair. And I think that, one of the things that I've been pushing in my own work with folks of color is that we have to focus on getting healthy. And you need to understand what you said is really a vital piece. When people ask, why can't white people see it? You don't see what you don't see unless nobody tells you, unless someone points it out to you. There's no reason, if you're a member of the majority dominant group, our society is not set up for them to see it or to care about it. So unless someone disrupts their thought pattern and their way of being, they're just going to be in their silo. I mean, that's the term that I've been using before it became popular, is that, you know, in this country, we live very racially siloed lives. Yeah. There are parts of the United States, and when I moved to Maine, it was the first time I really experienced that. There are whole parts of the United States where they don't see Black people. They don't see BIPOC people. They literally do not exist in their communities. They exist through a media frame. So whatever they're getting is filtered through this biased lens. So they can't understand you in parts of northern Maine because they've never had a Black person to live there. So once I got to the point where I can understand that, I could suddenly become less angry. I also don't feel that anger serves me. I would say I don't think it serves any of us in this work, because one of the things that I can say around the work that we do at CCI, and I know we're going to be wrapping up soon, so I want to just be able to talk about CCI just a little bit, is realizing that internal peace. For years now in anti-racism spaces, and we are explicitly anti-racist at CCI. You know, for 52 years, we've been doing a lot of the work that now has become commonplace. And for us going, why haven't we made the changes we expected? And a few years ago, our program director and I, Myrna Morales, and I were talking about it. And we're like, you know what? We have not touched white people's souls. We have not gotten to their hearts. And, you know, at first I was like, that sounds just really woo-woo-y. And then I realized, no, it's absolutely true. We don't buy into things unless we feel it on a soul gut level. And the problem with most of the work is it exists at a very surfacey level. And that if you're intellectual. Right. It's very intellectual. It's a head exercise. And I think like right now this year, that's what we've seen a lot of because of the news. People are getting it on this intellectual level, but you don't understand it until it's in a soul level. And at the soul level is where you will want to disrupt things. You will want to rise up. You will want to have that personal uprising, and people will probably start calling you a troublemaker. Might lose some friends, might lose some family members, but you also don't care at that point. You know, that's a really key piece of it. You don't care. You know, and I just would say to people of color in particular, the anger that can fuel some of our work, that comes back on us. You know, and I look at it for years. I've said, there's a reason that it's hard to find a Black person over the age of 40 who is not borderline hypertensive or in full-blown hypertension, because I think that our bodies at the molecular level, we carry that and it comes out. So, you know, for me, as I get older, it's like, I don't want to be stressed. I can't hold that. Like, I can't hold that. I have to let that go. Anger.
And it's not about you.
Right. It's not about me. That's someone else's anger to hold.
That's somebody else's problem, right? Like when you hold it and you carry it, then they most of the time, the person you're angry at doesn't even know. They're just happy going along about their day, and you left there with all the stuff.
That's exactly what happens. That is so exactly what happens. So it's like, you know, we've got to find a way to be in the work, to have the uprising, to work to shift the dominant culture, with also maintaining our own sense of self in that process. That's really, and it is tricky. That's where having a community, you know, some of the work that we're going to be launching. In fact, if you don't mind, I'm going to go into talking about community change.
You're the guest.
This year we are unveiling a new program called the Racial Healing Project, which is an extension of some work that we've been doing internally. And it is a project that's a lot more intense. We are doing it in cohorts where people will be brought together. They will develop a political education, a shared analysis around race, but also the understanding of how deeply critical interpersonal relationships are within anti-racism spaces. And that, in fact, without that, you're never going to build that true accountability. As we mentioned, I know at one point in the show, I'm the executive director of community change. We've got an event coming up on Friday, November 13th. Dr. Atyia Martin is our keynote speaker. It is our annual gala, which is called the Drylongso Awards. The title Drylongso comes from the book that was written in the late 1980s by John Langston Gwatney, which is called Drylongso, A Self-Portrait of Black America. And the point behind the awards event typically has always been to honor the extraordinary work done by ordinary people. And for us, that's always been folks within the greater Boston area. Well, this year's event is definitely going to be different. It's a virtual event. In fact, this year we only have one awardee, but we have a whole evening planned where we're going to be speaking about our programs. We have some virtual breakout rooms that I think people are going to love. We're going to have a health and wellness room. We're going to have our 3 partner groups talking about their work. We're going to have some art, some music. We're going to have a mixologist room, which I don't know what that says about me in the current moment. That's my favorite room I'm looking forward to, where I understand some guest bartenders will be shaking up things like Black Girl Magic and White Women's Tears. And we've got a really great bartender who's going to be helping me with the recipes on that. The event is complimentary, though, as I have to be honest, as the ED, I think in, bean counterways, we are asking if people have the ability to make a contribution. That you do, because typically this event serves as one of our largest fundraisers. But it's just going to be a great, great evening. We realize that everybody's zoomed out. So while the event is 2 hours, if you just want to come to the main part of the event, where you can hear Dr. Martin speak and you can hear me speak, that'll be 7 to 8 on Friday, November 13th. But there will be before things starting at 6:30 and a thing, for 8 to 8:30 if you want to come and, have a little fun with us. I believe we've got some scrolling information down there at the bottom. So you can log on to ccivirtual.org to get a ticket, and, hopefully we'll see you on the screen. So we are just so excited that Dr. Martin is going to be speaking. And you know what? This has been great. It took us however many years to connect. But, as I tell people, the beauty of Blackness and Black womanhood is that whenever sisters come together, I'm reminded of, to paraphrase Jesus, where 2 or more are gathered together in my name, there I am. And in this case, where 2 or more sisters are gathered together, that spirit of sisterhood that has held Black women together through the generations is always present.
That's right. We just got to get out of our own way. And connect and get whiteness out of the way, get conformity out of the way. And I want to reinforce, as we close out, the idea of supporting CCI. Please support the work that they're doing. The next thing I want to highlight is the need for reimagining, right? The need to reimagine who we are, which means unlearning a lot of things, relearning about ourselves, who we really are, who we really want to be. Let's not be afraid to look in the mirror. To Shay's point earlier, this work happens from the inside out. And if you find yourself spending too much of your time complaining about what other people are doing or not doing about racism or racial equity, then that means you're not doing enough work on yourself, not doing enough work on your organization, not doing enough work on what you have impact on in your own life and in the spaces that you occupy. And that's the way the kind of transformational change that we need to happens, right? And so I appreciate all of you for being here with us. This is not the end of this conversation. This is not the end of this. I think this is the beginning of something special and amazing. I appreciate you, Shay. I know how busy you are. And I'm just glad that you're here. I'm glad that we're here. I feel incredibly blessed. And I'm looking forward to seeing everyone. And as always, sending lots of love, hope, and action to all of you.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me as a guest. This has been absolutely a blast. And I look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks at this year's Drylongso event.
I'm looking forward to being there.
Great. Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.
Bye.